First of all, I just gave my presentation for the 2013 budget to the Toronto Police Services Board, and I can tell you I prepared for that by quickly scanning through a very large binder early this morning. I prepared for this really over the last month since Ratna Ahmedvar asked if I would be participating in this, because I find this far more challenging than defending a very large budget to the Toronto Police Services Board, and that's challenging. I find it challenging because of two reasons. You're not a group that I usually speak in front of, so I'm a little nervous. I didn't even bring my requisite firearm with me, so I'm feel very naked up here. But even more importantly, you're a group of people, whether you be students or involved in not-for-profits or involved in the infrastructure of the city, who are probably on a day-to-day basis doing things that are really important to safety in the city and livability in the city. If you're a student, simply going through your post-secondary education, graduating, and moving on into productive life means there'll be a lot less work for people like me. And if you're doing anything else that relates to making the city more livable and more safe directly or indirectly, you're making my job a lot easier. And as a resident of the city, you make my life in this city so much better. 5 good ideas. Maytree Foundation, first of all, thank you very much for putting this on. Ratna, you are a warrior of some repute, and a warrior in the charge of diversity and inclusivity and in advancing the city. That little pin that you have in your lapel does not speak in any way to the total value that you've brought to this city and to me, because you've been a great friend and a great mentor along the way. So thank you very much for inviting me and having me as part of your presentation. I hope I have 5 good ideas in addition to the ones you've just heard. The first one, I think it very much speaks to what we just heard. Champion. Challenge and change. We've got some very, very difficult situations happening in this city. Issues of racism and marginalization, a growing gap between rich and poor. We've got a lot of things that the Rotman U of T Business School described as wicked problems. They're wicked in some cases because they produce very, very terrible, tragic outcomes. People die. People die in unnecessary ways through poverty and through disease and through very preventable things like violence in a city, gun violence in particular, drug and gun and gang related violence. These are wicked problems. They didn't happen overnight. They're not going to be solved by any simple solution like more cops or less guns or longer jail sentences or no cops and whatever other simple little ideas you have. They're not going to solve this problem. So how do we get at these problems? And they're very real. They're very current. This is Danzig and Morningside, and we all kind of remember where we were when at Danzig and Morningside. This is a shot in the daytime. It's bright and sunny, and there's nothing particularly threatening about this location. But at this location, 2 young people died, and 26 people in total were wounded by gunfire. In the midst of all of this chaos, as the scene was still unfolding, even some of the victims themselves were reaching to the modern age devices of PDAs, accessing the global internet, contacting people locally and internationally to let them know what was going on. It became a huge Twitter bump right as this was unfolding. So in the middle of this critical crisis of almost biblical proportions in terms of Toronto, we had young people, middle class people, poor people, engaging on the internet, collaborating, sharing information. We had police officers and other public institutions looking to what was going on in mass media and social media, trying to gauge what the appropriate response should be, either in terms of tactical, in terms of policy and strategic. And we had 2 young people whose lives were snuffed out, who had great potential, one of which was reported, at least through the media, interested in being a police officer. Another young lady, far too young to be doing anything other than looking into her BlackBerry and looking at the world of the internet and dreaming all sorts of wonderful possibilities. She didn't get to fulfill those things. So jump back a couple decades into the 70s, 80s, and 90s into Bogota, Colombia. During that period, Bogota was the most violent city in the world, and Colombia was one of the most violent countries in the world. Its homicide rate was off the chart. You remember the movies of Scarface and Al Pacino? It was based on the conditions that were taking place in major urban centers like Bogota back in the day. And they had a homicide rate that would make our shooting rate look like a walk in the park. And people were not only dying from bullets, they were dying from car accidents. In fact, their vehicular homicide rate, deaths from vehicles, was off the charts as well, even more so than the homicides. Along came this guy, and he's not Superman, and I apologize, this is the only picture I can get of him in his uniform. This is Mayor Mocas of Bogota, Colombia, who is a university professor who decided to run for public office. I apologize for the Speedo look down there, but again, it's the only picture I could find. Mayor Mokas is an interesting guy, very, very intellectual. He's a problem solver, and he's a creative problem solver. And he was dealing with very wicked problems in Bogota, Colombia. He had a large police service, but they were not able to curb the endemic violence that was going on, either the gun violence or the traffic-related violence. He had a large population, and they had assets and resources, physical and otherwise, but he wasn't able to engage them and mobilize them around these wicked problems. So he started to use some very creative solutions. He used traffic mimes. He went to all his high accent locations. He went to the university in Bogota, and he took the people out of the arts program who were into acting. He put them in sort of mime outfits and put them down at those locations, and they directed traffic. And they approached people who were breaking the law by jaywalking, and they would make fun of them using their mime kind of thing. And you know what happened after 1 year of using mimes at traffic locations? They cut their traffic fatality rate by 50%. And they sustained that during his 2 terms of office. Did a similar thing for their gun and gang homicides. Most of it took place in licensed premises. Almost all of them took place with a gun. And there was always alcohol involved. So being the wicked smart professor that he was, he decided to close down the licensed premises, ban the sale of alcohol in the city during that time, and ban guns. He did a lot of other civic engagement things to rally people around these causes. And one of the main things he said is respect for the value of life. People in Bogota had forgotten how valuable life was. And so he reminded them, and he reinforced it. And he did practical things, as well as very, very altruistic, very, very purely communicative, engaging things, in order to get people to understand there's a different way to do business. And none of this cost a lot of money. They didn't have to hire thousands of cops. They didn't have to put up photo radar traps. They didn't have to completely destroy the social fabric of the city in order to produce some outstanding results. The homicide rates fell almost as much as the vehicle traffic rates as well. So this is Mayor Mokas looking a little more distinguished under his Superman costume. Champion new visions. He had a new vision for how Bogota could be. For over 2 decades, it was one of the most violent cities in the entire world. He had a new vision for a safer, more inclusive, more progressive city. He challenged the dominant culture, which at that point did not value life in the way that it should. It could step over dead bodies in the morning and go on with business. It could disregard the laws of the city and the lawmakers of the city and cause people to die. They did not value life in that city. And he changed the business model. It wasn't going to be all about cops and all about government and all about more legislation and all about what Bogota and Colombia was all about for decades. It was going to be a different operating model around which very different outcomes would come from. Google the Bogota experiment at your leisure. The data is all there. There's several articles and peer reviews and all sorts of things going on there. So, number 2. Maximize human capital, fancy business term, and leverage IT, an even more fancy business term. So what does that mean in real terms? Well, you had an introduction about me from Alan, who's a good friend and a great business leader. But what he told you about me and what you have in the little brief bio is only about 1% of who I really am. And really, quite frankly, doesn't reflect who I am. I did not arrive here because I'm a cop. Something I've done for 25 years and I'm proud of. But I didn't arrive in this position because I'm a cop. I'm not interested in the things I am interested in. I'm not passionate about the things I'm passionate about because I have an MBA. And the medals on my chest, while nice conversation pieces at events like this, really don't reflect the things I care about. That's a better picture, a richer picture of who I am. Equally, you do not see up there listed all of my outstanding failures and frustrations in life. You have only heard about what a wonderful walk-on-water success I've been. And that's simply not the case, because it's not the case with any of you. It's not the case with any human being. I have failed relationships. I've had failed management projects. I've had failed attempts to influence audiences like you and change your behavior to produce a more safe society. And that's why we have circumstances like Danzig. I've failed actually far more than I've succeeded. But I've continued to try to improve. So, human capital. What is the sum total of who we are as individuals? And when you look at an organization, whether there's 4 people, 5 people, or in our case, 8,000 people, what does the sum total of those human capital assets mean to you? And how are you using them? Are you fully utilizing them? Quick story, every police officer goes through this. You go through about a a 3-month process of being recruited, tested. You go through all sorts of physical tests, psychological tests, background tests, all sorts of things to become a police officer. Your raw material, we put you through another 5.5 months of training at the Toronto Police College and Ontario Police College. You learn the laws, you learn the use of force, you learn a whole lot of things about policing, and then you get your uniform all nicely pressed, you polish your shoes, you get your practice your marching, and it's graduation day. You get to graduate and march across the parade square and meet the chief and snap a salute and receive your badge, and as soon as you've gotten your badge, you head off to your police division where you've been assigned to, and you arrive there. Over the last 6 years, we've hired 1,600 police officers in the City of Toronto. Over 54% of them have been women and visible minorities. Over 60% of them have post-secondary education, and over 70% of them speak more than one language. Hugely rich human capital. And we made a very constructive and committed effort to make sure that we improve the human capital of the organization. But once that capital arrives into the actual structure and culture of policing, we start to do a terrible thing to it. Because that rookie cop gets assigned to a veteran cop who inevitably tells the rookie cop, don't touch the radio, don't do anything unless you ask me, and don't ask me anything because I'm not interested in anything you have to say. And about 2.5 years from now, when I think you've been around long enough, I might be interested in your opinion on something not related to policing, and then we'll see how we go from there. I'm being a little dramatic for the purposes here, but we've all been through that. Whether you're a new student in the class trying to figure out the mores and the rules of engagement, or you're new into a small organization that's tightly wound and underfunded, you know you've got to fit into the dominant culture, and that dominant culture will make you fit in, whether we're talking about policing or any other public sector. But it's what we do to our human capital. Kick it up a notch. Jane and Finch, 31 Division, one of the high violent crime areas for all of Canada, never mind the city. Hugely rich in assets. There's some good cops up there. There's industrial base up there. There's a sports complex that's produced some of Canada's best athletes up there. There's shopping and entertainment infrastructure up there. There's a hospital with a full buffet of healthcare services. There is one of Canada's largest universities. There are residents with great capital value in their land and the ability to generate their own entrepreneurial resources. There's cultural centers like the Jamaican Canadian Association. There are faith-based groups, and most importantly, there's a ton of young people. Hugely rich area. If you listen to the news, you'd think it's just all about poverty and marginalization and disempowerment, and there's nothing much that any good can come out of that area. I worked there for 2 years. It's a very rich area in human capital especially. And social capital, all these individual seemingly disparate things are very networked, very connected, very interconnected. You cannot get a relationship with the JCA if you don't have a relationship with the faith community. You can't leverage the young people there if you can't work with the health providers and the school boards up in that area. So you've got to become connected and interconnected if you want to get your job done. And so the social capital of any organization becomes critically important as well. And how do you leverage that in the age of the internet? Well, I love local people. Don Tapscott, who's a co-author of Macroeconomics, Wiconomics in the first instance, actually lives in the City of Toronto. After the Danzig shooting, interestingly, I called him up because I wanted to get some ideas about social media, in fact, for this very presentation. And he was very gracious to spend about 20 minutes on the phone with me. And he said, you know what, Peter, I live in the city, and what I see happening in the city really alarms me. I make a lot of money speaking to President Obama and traveling around the world talking about economics, but I'd like to help the Toronto Police to better leverage the digital age in order to produce a greater amount of public safety and public engagement. I said, Don, that'd be great. And he's going to work with us. He's going to help us. I've read his book, and I recommend it to you as one of the resources that I provided in your materials. But Don talks about not social media like Facebook and Twitter, or not digital media, meaning whether you like Apple or BlackBerry and where you put your shares and stuff like that. He talks about it as this is the age. This is it. And I'm sorry for any of you that at this point have still refused to get involved with social media and open up accounts and start to learn how to operate in that space and who's in that space. Because I can tell you what, the most brilliant thinkers of today are in there. And the most brilliant doers of tomorrow are the digital natives of today. I can tell you that one of the reasons why the gangs sprouted up this year is because they have adopted digital platforms far before the police have. They're far more skillful in using those tools. They use it to organize, share intelligence, plan events, deconstruct events after to try to hide evidence of their involvement. And we were missing part of the game that was going on, and that game snuck up behind us and bit us right in the butt. So I don't care what your background is, whether you're a student trying to put together a project for the tomorrow morning where you have to get online and you don't have access to an internet cafe, well, it's on your hip. The whole world of knowledge is on your hip. And working in the wiki way is not an individual thing. This is not hiding in the closet at night reading a Playboy magazine, all right? This is being connected. And so if you want to problem solve around how do you deal with guns and gangs and drugs in this city, how do you deal with very disenfranchised young people who could be so angry to come into a venue like this and take it over in the way that they tried to do, how do you work with that situation? Well, you've got to work with more than one person. This is not a police issue. This is a whole of city and a whole of society issue. Don talks about that in the book. Simple example in terms of public safety. In Kenya, about 5 or 6 years ago, a young man on a very rudimentary PDA device in the midst of a countrywide set of demonstrations, violent demonstrations. People were being killed, people were being injured, local security forces were being completely overwhelmed. There was no real response to this nationwide public safety threat. This individual got onto his PDA, used his tribal network of connections, his social network, to contact people all around the country on a very rudimentary satellite system, and was able to gather information on threat assessments for every part of the region. And was then able to connect that into the national security establishment to say, look, here's what's going on in region X, they're okay, they don't need any resources. Region Y is completely overwhelmed, there's lots of casualties, they need people right now. And through that very simple process, then dubbed Ushahidi, came a very rigorous, community-based infrastructure for gathering intelligence, mobilizing resources in support of public safety. Ushahidi was the main source of response to the Haitian earthquake 3 years ago. That's what organized major international response into Haiti. And so you can look at it the other end. And we had the 1-year anniversary of Occupy. And this was, again, a brilliant idea of hardworking, dedicated people who wanted to make an issue known. Whether you agree with their points or not is immaterial. It went from New York City, and the revolution was tweeted, and it spread across literally the entire globe. The revolution will not be televised. It will be tweeted. In fact, I get more regular intelligence information off my Twitter feed, my RSS feed, than I get from my intelligence officers up at, well, I can't tell you where they are because it's a secret. And no, I wouldn't have to kill you, but I'd have to take my pen out of my pocket like the Men in Black and go, bing. Anyway, I digress. So, what does policing in the future look like? There'll be old school bobbies walking the beat like the old British coppers used to do. There'll be the Adam 12 types in big fancy cars with lots of gadgetry racing around in emergency response, lights and sirens. But the future of policing, what will the future police officer look like? And what kind of tools will he or she have available to them? Well, I can guarantee you that they're going to have an internet-connected PDA that allows the world's knowledge to be on their hip. And I guarantee you that that PDA will be the most powerful instrument that that officer has. More powerful than a gun, their handcuffs, their badge, or anything else. Because that is the age in which policing is working in now. And they will be not on patrol alone in the middle of the night. They will be connected with young people and business leaders and thought leaders and academics and other networks in which to find out what's going on in the immediate vicinity and in the near vicinity around them. And in the morning, they'll have left a digital trail that you can wake up to and see where they walked, who they talked to, what they did, and how effective they were from multiple stakeholders' points of views. Put that into public health, put that into public education, put it into the private sector, and see how that resonates with you. Put it into the activist center, and see how more effective you can be. Diverse, meaning just like this room, men and women, old and young, private and public, black and white, gay and lesbian, diverse, PDA-enabled digital natives. That's who you want working in your organization. And if you haven't got them in sufficient capacity, you're already way behind the curve. And then you want those people to be more productive, more connected, more productive, and more accountable. Because the other thing that the digital age does, it means that there are no dark corners for police officers or teachers or pedophiles. There's nowhere that I can go where somebody doesn't have one of these, or there's a CCTV camera hooked up, or there's a camera on me right now. Everything I say, everything I do, will be recorded in some way and uploaded instantaneously to go viral across the world. And so transparency and accountability have exponentially increased with this age. Again, are you prepared to work with that and make it work for you, not against you? And by the way, as a caveat, everything I'm saying right now, we're struggling with, and I'm struggling with. I'm not doing a holier than thou. I'm no better, maybe no worse, but certainly no better than any one of you, and our organization is no better, maybe hopefully not any worse than any one of you as well. So please don't, if I sound a bit preachy, I don't mean to be. Idea number 3. Leadership competencies. What are the types of leaders that we need? Established leaders already in rank and position, and emerging leaders, like many of you in the room. And how are you going to do that in a world that is continuously in change? Not the kind of change that we talked about 10 years ago in my MBA. Vertical hyper change. Continuous hyper change. In the old school on the blackboard, they talked about these things in vague kind of ways. You know, we're going to have a 5-year business plan. You need a 5-day business plan. The only thing that's constant in the world is change. What does constant mean? What does constant mean? Because constant for us on January 1st was constant 6 years of year-over-year crime reduction and violent crime reduction. And then literally between December 31st and January 14th, we had 8 homicides. And then for the next 6 months, it just kept going up. So we were constantly going in the right direction. And then that constant became something very different. And I think you can all imagine different circumstances in your own world where that constant has been challenged. If you're just looking at the internet, that's what constant change means. It's not a slope, it's just vertical. It might actually double over on itself eventually. I love this slide. I'll just shut up for a second while you read it. So there's a gap between what you need to do and where you are. You can't walk across that gap because you're going to fall. You're going to hurt yourself or your clients. You got to jump. You need to leap. You got to gather your energy and your resources. You got to jump. And some of that is faith because you've never made a jump that far before. And some of that is pressure because the longer you take to decide to jump, the further that gap is. We all have to leap into things that we're not comfortable and we don't really know. There's a situation facing policing. It's been this way for a decade and a half. A group of universities got together out of the UK and they did a study of mostly Western-based police agencies, so I put that as a caveat. UK, Western Europe, North America, certainly City of Toronto. And they said there's more and more police officers. And some of you like police officers and some of you don't, but there's more and more of us. We've been hired in greater numbers over this last decade and a half than any other period of time. And we do what police officers do, which for the most part is enforcement, writing traffic tags on the street and stopping speeders and arresting people involved in crime. And jails have filled further than any other time in history. That seems to be a good thing if you think crime is going down. And in fact, crime is going down. Not in all cases and not equally, but crime in general over the last period of 15 to 20 years have been going down. But fear of crime has been going up and trust in policing is going down. So you have this inverse relationship that logically doesn't make sense. It's been titled the reassurance gap out of this particular study. And if you look at marginalized communities, new immigrants, people of color, women, LGBT, poor, the homeless, that gap and that disparity is even wider. If we were private business, Alan, I would venture to say that we were about to enter into a death spiral. All of what we think we're doing that should be working in the right way and our key metric are going the right way. But these other two things are not. They're going in the inverse way. If you add it to the fact that there are now less and less police officers because we're in an economic downturn and we're not hiring as much. In fact, we haven't hired in 2 years and we're down 200 police officers. And I'm not crying woe with me, I'm just stating the facts. And some types of crime, like we've seen this year, are coming back up again. How do you think that trust and fear factor is going to be if we don't do something different, if we don't take a big leap? We haven't got an answer for that just now, so maybe that's one of the things you can talk about at your tables and help me with after on. One person who has some really interesting ideas about this, sorry, I'm getting feedback there, so are you. Roger Martin, who is the Dean of the U of T Rotman School. I always like to use local sources if I can. Roger Martin talked about the opposable mind in his book, and really what he was talking about was integrative thinking. So I would be sitting down with one of the nurse practitioners in here. Can you just put your hands up, ladies, gentlemen? Don't be shy. Really, I saw you you were the only brave one. God bless you. Nursing student? Okay, sorry, my bad on terminology. So You and I will be talking later on, and you'll tell me about something that you're doing in your training, some problem that you're facing in terms of trying to triage people. And I'm thinking, okay, triage, coming into an emergency room, and how do you go through your factors, and how do you process, and how do you do that bedside manner customer service thing while people are angry, and people around them are angry and nervous. And that's the same thing when I go to a Danzig shooting scene and I'm trying to triage shooting victims, and I got angry friends and people wanting information, people trying to cross the lines and jumping the queues, and we're trying to get a process down that we need to get to court later on, and you've got a process that you have to do. And I'm thinking, you know what, I can learn something from you, and I can bring that into policing. I can integrate knowledge from your very different world into my very different world. I can find common ground from your very different world in my not so different world. And I can produce something different, and you can learn from me, and you can produce something different, and that different will be better. And that'll help us make that leap. And that's what Roger Martin was talking about, integrative thinking. And so he talks about taking different disciplines and different perspectives. So this might be an Afrocentric perspective, this might be an Aboriginal perspective, this might be a youth perspective, this might be a person with disabilities perspective, and a different discipline. Mashing them together, working together. And I mean working, because this is not easy. It's not easy to understand each other in different terminology, different cultures. It's really hard to work together. And coming up with something that we co-create, new knowledge, better solutions for really complex problems, wicked problems. And if you want to bring different perspectives into it, you can't just be talking about, well, I got Jabari who's black, I got this young lady who's Asian and a lady and she's young, and so I got 3 different kind of diverse people here, and we're going to get something better out of this, right? That's how it works, right? You just kind of sprinkle the room with some different colored fruit and different vegetables, and all of a sudden knowledge comes out, right? No, because every one of us still have biases, and every one of us still have limited human capacity to get along with each other, and we all have our agendas, and some of them shout out in the middle of other people's agendas, but that's just the way it is. It's messy work. It's work. Well, your cultural competency has to be good. More importantly, your intercultural competency. I use a diagnostic tool that I find very helpful to personally develop me in my own executive development. It's called an interculturally development inventory. I've taken the test. I thought I was really good at this, and this tool said I had a long way to go on a continuum. And you know what? That's okay, because it's constructive criticism. And if I'm a real professional, I'm going to listen to that, I'm going to wrestle with it, I'm going to take from it something that's going to make me better. Hamlin Grange is a former board member of the Toronto Police Services Board. He's also an expert in the practitioner, in the practice of the competency tool that I'm talking about. He was the one that administered the test. He has coached me and mentored me on the results of it. And I've actually found myself better at dealing with not just the issues of physical diversity, but diversity of perspectives, more importantly. And it's helped me to become able to navigate difficult situations, bring people together, and get something more productive out of those interactions. We're planning to bring this tool into the Toronto Police Service. We're going to scale it because it's not without a cost, and we have to be careful about cost, but we believe that this is a tool that will help us to deal with issues like racial profiling and bias in policing and internal issues like workplace harassment. It's personal and it's organizational. It can be at the individual unit level, and it can be aggregate in its application. It is not training, because we have enough sensitivity training in our world. It's coaching, development, mentoring, feedback. It's not punitive. It's meant to develop. And I gave that as another resource for you to consider in your work within your organizations. But we need more than just that in terms of leadership. And I keep coming back to the digital world. We need to share information between the public health sector and the public police sector, between the public education sector and City Hall. We need to share information about graduation rates, incarceration rates, stop rates, whatever the rates are, in order to understand what's going on, in order to get to the solutions below. And that's not easy, because we are hyper sensitive about our information. When the Toronto Star comes asking for information about their latest racial profiling story, we all go, oh my God, they're coming again. But you know what? That series of stories has done more to advance the issue of racial profiling within policing in Toronto and across the country than anything else. And so the little bit of sharing of information that we did do has produced a large effect. Is it enough? No. Do we need to go further? Yes. But it's difficult. When you do that, though, you share power. When you share information, and if knowledge is power and you share that, you're sharing power. And when you share power, you empower. And when you empower others, if it's a good relationship, it'll come back to you again. This guy was really good at all those things. Really, really good. He was integrated. He knew his industry, he knew his company, he knew his key people. He could get them to innovate, and I don't know much about the intercultural piece, but I just wanted to throw the third eye in there because it worked. But I think that's a pretty good model of a new leader, a new age leader, in terms of what he can do as an individual and what he can do as in a company and what he can do culturally, societally, globally. Fourth idea, full circle community mobilization. Now I'm going to switch from sort of a general kind of theme into more public safety policing, and I apologize. This was also done at about 4 o'clock in the morning. I've got really bad sciatica, which just kind of flamed up an old soccer injury. I'd like to say it's an old war injury, but it's just an old soccer injury. And I'm really having a lot of pain, and I was on tranquilizers at this point trying to get the pain out so I could finish off this presentation. So it gets a bit wonky here. I apologize. This is Chief Dale McPhee. He's a chief of a 40,000 person city called Prince Albert in Saskatchewan. Heavy First Nations population. One of the most crime-prone cities in Canada. Much higher crime rate and violent crime rate than Toronto. Much less in terms of physical capital, human capital to work with. He did some research and looked at a hub service delivery model for policing. More importantly, hub service delivery model for public safety. He said the cops can't do it on their own. We don't have enough money. I can't hire enough police officers to keep up with the crime rate. And my police officers don't have the skills to deal with the problems of alcoholism and domestic violence and historical issues of the residential schools and hundreds of years of abuse within this paradigm. I just don't have the capacity. I need to work with other people. Some of this is a policing problem. Most of this isn't. Who do I get around the table? He talked about Joe's story. Joe was a local kid who went through the usual process. Single parent home, below the poverty line, alcohol and other dependencies within the home. Went through a series of foster homes before coming back to the home again. Got into the juvenile system for minor assaults and mischief making. Ended up into a gang, an Aboriginal street gang. Was victimized, then became a victimizer, went to jail, did federal time after doing provincial time. Was almost killed in prison, came back out, shortly after coming back out, went back into the gang culture and was ultimately the victim of a homicide. And they tracked Joe back from the day he died to the day he was born. And they identified 14 clear points of intervention around which any one of the public sector providers, from public education to public health and the public justice system, could have intervened in Joan's life to make a material difference, to move him off that path to sure destruction and onto a path of at least a chance of success in life. And for every Joe there is in Prince Albert, there's 1,000 Joes here in the city. There are examples of hub service delivery across the city, some great examples. None of them have a police at the table, and none of them have the full breadth of agencies, not-for-profits, public-funded, whatever the case may be. I sent the team of my people out to Prince Albert because there was gold to be mined out west. We sent the team out to look at Little Prince Albert and Dale McPhee's model. And they discovered that it wasn't just the police at the table. This is Prince Albert's hub. These are the agencies that sit around there, the boards of education, health. Yeah, the police are there. Welfare, income assistance, addictions, mental health. And they case conference an individual, the Joe of the day. What helps do they need? Who's best positioned? What combinations of interventions will make the best evidence-based chance of changing the conditions that Joe is in right now? Then they built a business process, because it's hard to work together. We all have different information sharing rules. We all have different nomenclature. We all have different cultures. We have different ways of talking and dealing with things. And so they had to figure out how to do it. They put a process in place. I'm not going to go through the entire process. Again, this is another one of your resources that I provided for you. But it works. And it's working in Prince Albert, and it's working in Glasgow, and it's working south of the border. And we're going to try and make it work here. In fact, we're going to be putting a similar hub, almost exactly the same, up in North Etobicoke in 23 Division, which has been off the charts violence and gun violence this year. And it fits into our local community mobilization model. This model took us so far as to say you need to work with communities. It didn't tell us how to work with communities. It said you had to work with different agencies. It didn't map out what you were supposed to do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. Prince Albert's model does. And so we're going in that direction. Number 5, and I know I've gone over time here. Ratna's big on the watch, and she's giving me the the hairy eyeball over there. I can feel it. Told you, don't mess with that lady. New outcomes. So what? So what does all this do? Well, what it does is reinforce and continue to move us down the road of a well-deserved reputation of being one of the safest cities, major urban centers in North America. Terrible tragedies, preventable tragedies of the Eaton Center and Danzig and Jane Creba and the hundreds of black men, young men that have died over the decades. We're still one of the safest cities, but that is no record to stand pat on. Diversity, livability, commerce, safety. We've got a lot to be proud of. We've got a solid foundation upon which to work. We're not in crisis, despite what some people might say. But there are critical issues that need to be dealt with, or we can be in crisis very quickly. That hub model out in Prince Albert identified new types of outcomes. And yeah, some of it is reduced crime and safety factors that we are that's our bread and butter. But there are economic indicators. There's school dropout participation completion rates. Improvement factors for marginalized populations, like their Aboriginal population, our young black population. There's the ability to see whether or not reliance on social services is being weaned off and they're on into entrepreneurial skills and onto their own self-determination and economic capacity. And I won't bore you with all the different measures, but they're not the typical measures. Crime up, crime down, homicides up, homicides down, shootings up, shootings down. We're being challenged now by Chief Blair to look at our business less as enforcement, the protect side, and more on the serve side, customer service. So who do we serve? In the Toronto region, in Toronto particularly, there is a very, very widening gap between rich and poor, the inner city and the outer city. And within there, the marginalized and the victimized are our main customers. I don't know who your customer base is, but that's our main customers. And who are they? Some of them are taxpayers. Some of them are citizens, meaning Canadian citizens. But there are a whole bunch of different people as well. And they all need to have excellent service, consistently excellent service, consistently improving excellent service, because the context that they find themselves in are constantly changing. And they're wicked issues that don't get solved with simple solutions. And so we know we can't serve these clients alone. Back to that hub service delivery model. We want to get there. We're not there now. In fact, that check mark might be in the poor box, but we're determined to move it up into the excellent box. And with all that going on, we have an economic crisis. And so I'm going to finish on this particular area of creating public value. Now, I was told about this book about 8 months ago. I bought it 6 months ago. I started reading it 3 months ago. I put it down and I picked it up again. It's a bit of a tough chew at the beginning. I finally got it in my hands because I knew I had to present today, and I started reading it like crazy about a week ago. And you know what? It's one of the best books I've ever read. I haven't finished it though. I'm only about a third of the way through. It's really reinforced in my mind about what public stewardship is of a public institution, what management and managing for value is. It's still complex. It's a hard chew. But I have written more and dog-eared and circled stuff and highlighted stuff out of that first third of the book than any other book I've read in a long, long time. And I encourage any of you going into the public sector to look at it. There's as many lessons around the private sector as is the public sector, and a lot of overlap. So we're trying to get into creating public value, but we're struggling. What more than keeping crime down? What other valuable things can and should the Toronto Police be doing? And how should we create more value by working with other agencies? Those that like us and those that don't like us. How do we work with them to create more value? And so that's one of the things I would like you to discuss. The book talks about 3 maxims though. Any public sector, whether you're not-for-profit with 4 people or you're a paid public agency with 8,000 employees, how do you demonstrate maximum productivity with minimum cost? If you're looking at grant funds and they're shrinking, then how do you maintain and demonstrate to your clients and to your funders maximum productivity with shrinking funds or shrinking tax base in terms of us as a cost center? How do you achieve overall civic policy objectives? I'm not talking about any particular mayor or premier's objectives, but there's an elected democratic process in the city, whether you like it or not. There are policies and priorities within that process at municipal and provincial and federal levels. And if you're getting grant money from any of those levels, or you're being paid directly by any of those levels because you're an agency of those levels, How do you achieve that policy level and meet the needs of those most marginalized and victimized elements of your client base? How do you balance that out, particularly with the economic pressures that we're having right now? And then the final thing, how do you collaborate? And through collaborating, innovate in ways that allow you to make that leap and get to a point where you actually start to solve in a sustainable way those very complex, very wicked problems. We're a big business, as Alan alluded to. We got 8,000 people, we got a command structure, we got org charts, we got divisional boundaries, all the makings of a big business. We got service priorities and strategic plans and core values. We got budgets and pie charts and graphs and all that stuff. And I sit somewhere on that box. But the most important thing that we have are people. Real human beings with real human capital. And those people are connected and interconnected and connecting and interconnecting in very interesting ways, in ways that you may not realize on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, month-to-month basis, year-to-year, decade-to-decade. And that's our most important resource. 90% of our budget goes to paying people. Only 10% is left over for ballpoint pens and putting gas into the cars and buying new Blackberries when it drops on the bathroom floor at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're really tired and trying to get your presentation ready. And although sometimes we look like a big army, a big sea of blue, and that can be very intimidating, and sometimes it can be very destructive, interruptive in a community, in a person's life, we're still made up of human beings. We're still made up of individuals. And they have lives and hopes and aspirations, fears and frustrations and failures like every single one of you. We still bleed. Sometimes we die. Sometimes we leave behind a legacy that you don't want to leave just yet. So, those are my 5 good ideas about how to improve public safety, public service, public trust, and public value. Thank you very much for your time.